Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session on IDEA to ADA, the difference between high school and college accommodations. I'm Annie Tulkin. I am the founder and director of Accessible College. I'm sorry that I could not join you in person today. I have a cold, which I am hoping is not COVID, but out of an abundance of caution, I thought it was better to stay home and not risk it. So hopefully you'll gain some information and insight from this presentation. And of course, I'll include my contact information at the end. So if you want to reach out, you can connect with me that way too. So I'm going to go ahead and jump on in. And I can also make the presentation available to everyone as well too. I can connect with Lisa to help do that. So just a little bit about myself. As I said, I'm Annie Tulkin. I'm the founder and director of Accessible College. And the mission of Accessible College is to provide students with physical disabilities and health conditions and their families with the support to ensure a successful transition to higher education. So in my practice, I work with students with a variety of health conditions, things like POTS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, lupus, cancer, chronic fatigue, Crohn's disease, and also students with mental health conditions too, because there's a lot of comorbidity or co-occurring conditions that students have. And I also support students with physical disabilities, so students who use wheelchairs and other types of mobility devices. I also support students with visual impairments and hearing impairments as well, and other types of sensory impairments too. And I do this because colleges provide varying levels of support to students with disabilities and health conditions. So the services that I provide through my business, Accessible College, help to create a bridge to empower students and families to effectively work together to create positive educational experiences for the student. I have over 12 years of experience in the disability field. Nearly 6 of those were spent as the associate director of the Academic Resource Center at Georgetown University, which is Georgetown's Disability Support Office. And my experience spans both nationally and internationally. I was a Peace Corps volunteer and a Fulbright Fellow, both in Mongolia, where I studied Mongolian teachers' perceptions of disability in the classroom. And my expertise and background is in education. I have a master's in special education from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a certificate in health coaching from Georgetown University. And my undergraduate degree was from DePaul University in secondary education. So I really lead my practice from a teaching perspective. But the catalyst for me to start Accessible College was my time spent at Georgetown. And this provides important context, so that's why I feel it's important to share. So I worked with undergraduate, graduate, and medical school students at Georgetown who were seeking accommodations. So I was the person that students were talking to about their accommodation needs. I was the person who they were engaging with on the interactive process, which is what we call the accommodations process in the college setting. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that many students were coming in without really knowing what their role was in the accommodations process. They hadn't really thought through the types of accommodations they might need in the college setting. They didn't know that accommodations were not just for academics, but they are also may apply to housing and recreation, transportation, dining. And because it's so different when you're living at home with your guardians and you're moving onto a college campus where your guardians are not there typically, students have a lot of challenges related to that transition, and specifically students with disabilities. So there are some other things that students need to be thinking about. And I am using the term disability here in this presentation, and I'm using that language because that's the language of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which is the law that guides the college accommodations process. And so why don't we dive into some facts around disability in the college setting? So we have some statistics, and these come from different federal data sets, but the first one is that approximately 19% of undergraduate college students report having a disability, and that includes learning disabilities, ADD, mobility impairments, psychiatric conditions, and health conditions as well. So these are the students who have gone to the Disability Support Office, and I should say that every college or university has a disability support office or a person who is tasked with coordinating the accommodations process for students. All of those offices have different names. So it might be Student Accessibility Services, it could be Accessibility Services, it might be Disability Support Services. You can usually find that office by going to the college's website and just putting in Student Disability Services. That should bring it up. But this 19% number, those are the students who have gone to the Disability Support Office, requested the accommodations, and been approved for the accommodations. So it's highly likely that the number of actual students with disabilities on any given college campus is a lot higher, because there's probably a portion of students who have either decided that they don't want to receive accommodations in the college setting for whatever reason, so they've opted out of the process. And then there's probably another set of students who have who don't know that they could be approved for accommodations based on their condition. A lot of students with health conditions don't consider themselves to be disabled, and so they don't think that the accommodations process could apply to them, even if they're having a flare-up of their condition, which might impact their ability to engage in classes and things like that. So we can assume that the number of students with disabilities on college campuses is much higher, just like in the regular world, where people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the United States, and we know that 1 in 4 people have a disability. The other interesting fact that we have here is that approximately 7% of college students who report having a disability indicate that they have a physical disability or a mobility impairment. And this is an interesting number too, because it shows us that students with physical disabilities are a much smaller portion of the overall population of people with disabilities, but they're on college campuses. And I think, as we've seen, because of IDEA in the K through 12 setting, we're seeing more and more students mainstreamed into classrooms, and there are more and more students who are going on to college. The facts that aren't on here are the completion rates for students with disabilities, which the data is not great. So I didn't put it up here, but we do know that students with disabilities typically take longer to complete college, and the dropout rates are much higher for students with disabilities too. So it's just important to contextualize that as we enter into this conversation and start to explore how we can better prepare students and families for this transition. So in order to really understand kind of the lay of the land here, I wanted to talk about the laws that apply to all of the transition process, not just the college setting. So first, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which is the law that governs special education services for students with disabilities and provides for free and appropriate public education services in the K through 12 setting. So if your student has an IEP, an individualized education program, it's because of that law. That's because of IDEA. If your student is in a private school, those schools are not bound by IDEA, but that leads us to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And this law protects against discrimination on the basis of a disability. So your student might have a 504 plan, which outlines their accommodations. Private and public schools both have to adhere to Section 504, and it applies to college as well. However, important note here, this does not mean that your student's 504 plan will travel with them to college. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So when the student graduates high school and moves on to college, the accommodations process is governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. We're coming up on the 31st anniversary of the ADA. So it's been around a while, but it's always a work in progress. And there's a big difference from high school and going into college. And that big difference is that the student has to lead the process when they go to college. So the student has to self-disclose their disability to the Disability Support Office and follow the process of requesting accommodations more independently. So parents are not really a part of the process of accommodations in the college setting, which leads to the next law that's important in this context, which is FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So because of FERPA, colleges aren't allowed to share information about the students, about their grades, their class schedules, any disciplinary actions. Parents are usually surprised by this law because many parents think if I'm paying for this education, I should have access to this information. And so if parents want to have access to that information, they need to connect with their student and have a conversation. And then the student and the parent would need to connect with the college or university to sign what is known as a FERPA waiver. And that would allow the parent to have, or guardian, to have access to that information. And that kicks in, FERPA kicks in once the student matriculates to college, which is a fancy way of saying once they sign that dotted line and they've committed to their college. Excuse me, I wanted to take a second here to look at the differences between accommodations in the high school setting and in the college setting, because I found that a lot of families are really unaware of how this looks in practice, right? So in high school, students are often identified by the school, and the teachers and administrators typically know what the accommodations are. They're outlined in an IEP or a 504 plan. The teachers might even know the student's condition. And it's important to know that in college, the student has to self-disclose to that disability support office. So they have to disclose it. They have to be able to talk about what their needs are. They have to follow that process for requesting accommodations in a more formal way. Their teachers or instructors don't know what their condition is. So in college, students get a letter, an accommodation letter that either gets emailed to their professors or they bring a physical copy to their professors. It does not indicate on it what the student's condition is because that is protected information. So if the student chooses, they can disclose what their condition is to that professor, but they don't have to. In high school, typically the school takes the lead in arranging for accommodations. So for example, if your student gets extra time on tests, the school knows and they make those arrangements for the student usually, or they're supposed to. But in college, it's the student's responsibility to arrange their accommodations. So they have to go through that interactive process, be approved for the accommodations, connect with each of their professors to discuss their accommodations, and continuing with the example of the extra time for exams, that usually requires the student to make a reservation to take the exam with the Disability Support Office at least 7 days in advance. Or some schools don't have a separate testing facility, so they have to arrange it directly with the professor so that they can get their test taking accommodation. But this requires organizational skills and planning and executive function skills. And it's something that can usually trip a lot of students up in the process of having to figure out how do I get the things, the accommodations that I need for these exams. So the last one here, in high school, teachers are usually able to identify when the student needs support. So they can connect with the parents or the guardians, they can share information. But in college, the student has to be proactive in seeking out support by going to office hours, hiring tutors, maybe taking advantage of supports that the school offers. Maybe the school might offer academic coaching, or they might offer other types of services like a writing center or peer mentoring. And that's a big shift because the students have to be able to identify when something is not working well, and they have to take that next step of actually seeking out support. So this is why starting to develop self-advocacy skills and self-awareness skills early is really, really important to students so that we can make sure that we're ensuring them and setting them up for success in college. We also know that transition services really vary from high school to high school and school district to school district. So if your student has an IEP, transition is supposed to be a part of that conversation. But if your student has a 504 plan, they typically don't receive any transition support services or planning. So for students with physical disabilities and health conditions that fall maybe outside of the scope of what a college counselor or a school learning specialist has navigated before, these students might need more intentional kind of focused support. And that's the kind of support that I do with students and families, often working alongside their high school counselor or their college counselor, college consultant to figure out what they need to put in place so that they can be successful in college. We talked a little bit about the process for requesting accommodations, and now I'd like to share some information about the documentation that's needed. So it's really important for students to start thinking about and gathering some of this information. A good practice for students is to put their documentation maybe on a flash drive or shared in or stored in Google Drive to start getting that information together. The first thing that families will want to do is check out the Disability Support Office's website. Each college establishes their own criteria for the types of documentation they will accept. And so it's important that you're looking at what the college is requiring before you start getting new documentation or doing things like that. So first part is establishing a disability. So for learning disabilities, for ADD, you'll likely need to provide the full neuropsych evaluation that's been completed in the last 3 to 5 years. And some schools have different rules around that. So you'll want to check with that disability support office. Most colleges do not accept an IEP as a primary form of documentation, but some do. So you'd want to check and see what that school requires. If your student has a mental health condition like anxiety, bipolar disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, the school will likely want a psychological evaluation or a letter from their treating psychologist or psychiatrist that outlines what their needs are and what their condition is. For students with chronic illnesses or physical disabilities or visual impairments or hearing impairments, they'll likely have to provide a letter from their healthcare provider that documents their condition and their functional limitations, which is Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA speak for how does their condition impact them in the college setting. So most schools actually provide a template that physicians can use and fill out when the student needs documentation. So you'll want to go ahead and check with the school and see what type of documentation they require. And if you have questions, you can always connect with the disability support offices in advance. And in fact, I would recommend that students engage with the disability support offices prior to applying and absolutely prior to committing so that they know what supports they can receive. And it's important for families to understand that the admissions process is distinctly separate from the accommodations process. So there's no checkbox when you're applying to college of do you have a disability? That's something you can choose to disclose. Students might write about their condition in their personal essays, but that's separate from the disability support office. So even if they disclose in their application, they still need to go through the process of connecting with the disability support office to request accommodations. Supplementary documentation. So these are types of documentation that might provide history, relevant information for the disability support office professionals, but they're not typically accepted as a primary source of documentation. So I mentioned one of those things before, which is the IEP. That would provide the college with a better understanding of the types of accommodations that the student had in high school, but generally it's not accepted as a primary form of documentation. But again, there are exceptions. So check with the college that your student is going to see if they accept IEPs as a primary form of documentation. The 504 plan, it's also good to share this as well. It gives the Disability Support Office an understanding of the types of accommodations that a student has received. But again, the college is not required to provide the same accommodations because they're using the ADA to provide reasonable accommodations for the student. And what is reasonable might vary from school to school or program to program. So it's important to be having upfront conversations with the disability support offices about this. Your student might also have a letter from their high school outlining the accommodations that they were provided with. They can also submit their ACT or SAT accommodations letter too. These are really good documents to just provide. They give the Disability Support Office a understanding of the types of supports the student had. But if you have questions about what sorts of documentation are required or are needed, contact that Disability Support Office directly, check out their website and see what they've listed there. It's really important to understand that colleges provide support at different levels. So all colleges that are federally funded, which are pretty much every college in the United States, except for literally a handful of schools which don't receive any federal funding, they're all required to provide reasonable accommodations under the ADA, and reasonable accommodations is in air quotes, because that leaves a little bit of room for subjectivity about what is reasonable. So while accommodations like extra time, preferential seating, or a note taker are relatively common in college, the way in which the accommodation is administered, it can vary greatly from college to college. So each college has their own process and disability support office. And so it's important to understand how that college will administer the accommodations and the care in which they will provide it. The note-taking example is a really good one. Some schools are using assistive technology to provide notes for students. Other schools are using in-person note takers. Some schools are just providing transcripts of the class. So these are really good things to investigate prior to committing to that school. So all colleges provide that base of reasonable accommodations under the ADA. Most colleges offer some educational support to students, like a writing center, tutoring services for specific subject areas. And further, some colleges also offer academic services where the student can meet with a professional, like a learning specialist, or attend workshops to discuss things like time management, study skills, reading strategies, test preparation. Some colleges also offer services to support students with learning disabilities, ADD, autism, other executive function challenges. And so students who have needs are struggling with the executive function components and maybe need a little bit more resources when they're on a college campus might want to look for a school that has a supplementary learning disability program to provide more coaching, more frequent check-ins. Sometimes some of these programs provide independent living and social skills supports. These are usually fee-based and application-based programs, and they typically offer, a range of academic supports, and they are different in some of the supports that they provide. So you would want to investigate, if you have a student who has more needs, you'd want to investigate each of those programs individually to see which one might be a good fit for your student. The thing that's really another kind of critical piece to remember is that colleges are required to provide accommodations for all areas of campus life. So this is a little bit different from high school, when things are mostly focused on academics, but colleges are required to provide accommodations for housing, transportation, dining, recreation. Some of these things might be similar to what the student had in high school, but some accommodations in college might be different from what the student had in high school. So for example, if your student has a one-on-one aide in their high school setting, that's not an accommodation that colleges provide. So that is considered a supplementary service. And so if the student needs a one-on-one aide, either for personal care or for added support, you'd want to connect with the disability support offices at that university and maybe seek out a fee-based program that has some additional supports, or if your student has a physical disability and they need to hire a personal care attendant, um, that's another piece of this puzzle. And so students would have to hire that person independently and then work with the disability support office to allow that person to assist them in class or to live with them in the residence hall. So when you're considering the types of accommodations that a student might need when they're living on a college campus, it's really critical that you think about this holistically. So they might have some different needs related to dining and to medication management and things like that. And you'd want to start working with your student on these things early so that when they go and live independently, they have a structure set up for themselves so that they're prepared to navigate those pieces independently. I've put a list together here of just some accommodation considerations. I find that it's good to give people some examples of what I'm talking about. So these are accommodation considerations for students with learning disabilities, maybe health conditions and mental health conditions as well. And I'll talk through some of these pieces here. So for some of the academic accommodations that students with learning disabilities or health and mental health conditions might consider, extra time could be a factor, right? If your student has a processing disorder or needs extra time because of brain fog related to medication, that's a typical accommodation. A laptop in class, that's something a student would need to ask for as an accommodation. There are still college professors who do not allow technology in the classroom. So if your student needs to be able to use a laptop to take notes in class, that's something they would have to request as an accommodation. Some students might need a reduced course load. Many colleges require that students have 12 credits each semester, which is considered full-time. If your student needs to take less than that, 9 credits or less, they would have to request a reduced course load as an accommodation. The important thing to remember there is that that can impact financial aid. So you'd want to have a conversation and look at that with the Disability Support Office and the Financial Aid Office as well. Some students might need flexibility in attendance if their condition has flare-ups. That could be a mental health issue, or if they have Crohn's disease or POTS or something like that, where they have a flare-up of their condition, they might need to have that flexibility. And that accommodation works a little bit differently at every university. Professors have a lot of discretion on what can be allowed. So even if the student has the accommodation for flexibility in attendance, they still have to connect with the professor. They still have to have conversations about how they're going to make up that work. And it's really important that students understand that it's not just an accommodation that will be granted across the board. They're still expected to have these conversations. Some colleges also provide assistive technology. Some schools provide training on assistive technology too. If your student needs assistive technology and they need support with the assistive technology, you'll want to look at what that school provides before they commit to that school. Priority registration, that could be a thing that students are also requesting if they have medication issues or if they need a certain time that they function better, they might want to request priority registration. Some students might also need a service animal. And service animals are different from emotional support animals, which we will talk about in a second. A service animal provides a service for the person, so like opening a door or helping them navigate a space, or can alert them if they're having a seizure, things like that. That's different from an emotional support animal, which leads us to the residential section. And I'll talk about emotional support animals first. So emotional support animals can be any type of animal that the student elects to have. They'd need to provide documentation to the university of why they need that emotional support animal, but emotional support animals have to stay in the residential setting, so in the dormitory. So that's important to understand. But you'd want to talk to the Disability Support Office about what their rules are around having an ESA in the dorm. Some students might want to request a single room that could be just for mental health management or they might need a single room if they need more space to manage their own healthcare needs. A lot of students have injectable medications or other medications and things like that. So there are a lot of reasons that a student might want to request a single room. They could also request fewer roommates. That could be a reasonable accommodation, maybe a lower floor. A private bathroom. A lot of students who have gastrointestinal conditions need more time in the bathroom, or if they have other medical issues where a private bathroom might be essential, they can request that as an accommodation. Dining, if your student has a special diet or food allergies, celiac, peanut, shellfish allergies, you're definitely going to want to connect with the dining services to have a conversation and also potentially request accommodations around dining. Transportation, some colleges provide transportation between classes. Some do point to point for students with disabilities, and that might be students who have a health condition where they have chronic fatigue or they have trouble getting around. So that would be something to inquire about. Other schools provide transportation on campus if it's a larger campus, so you'd want to investigate that as well. It's just important to be thinking about the students' needs across the board. So physical disabilities and kind of bringing in the more chronic health condition piece here too. There's some other accommodations that students might want to consider. We've covered some of these. For students with physical disabilities, they might also need priority registration if they have a personal care attendant who's coming to support them in the morning. Morning classes might not be a good choice, so priority registration would allow them to choose class times that work for them. They might also need a scribe in the classroom if they have hand mobility issues. Each school handles that a little bit differently. They might only provide the scribe for classroom or for exams. They might not provide it for homework or other related things. So you'd want to be talking to the disability support office about how that looks. Classroom relocation, so that you're getting an accessible space, so that you're making sure that your classes are centrally located. Having accessible furniture, that's another key piece of the puzzle for a lot of students with physical disabilities, or if they use a mobility device that they need to ride up to the desk in. It's important to be investigating these things up front. On the residential front, it might be ADA accessible, could be a single room, a lower floor, the ability to have a personal care attendant live in the in the residence hall and or come to the residence hall. So usually that's orchestrated through the disability support office, and that person would be allowed to come and they'd get a swipe card to be able to enter that residence hall. Recreation is another piece of this puzzle. Adaptive fitness equipment. So it could be, weights machines or other types of machines in the fitness center, but also it could be accessible gaming equipment. If the student center has gaming, every student should be able to access whatever is available to all students. And so there might be some requests around that too. Oop, I skipped ahead. And in terms of dining, some students, if you have visual impairment or you have a physical disability, you might need help with food selection, getting a tray, bringing that to a table. So that could be another piece of this puzzle as well. And then that transportation piece, investigating what's available on that campus. Some schools actually have, like golf carts or vans, and they have people who will help students get transported around. Other schools don't have any transportation that they provide on campus. So in that case, they would not be required to provide students with anything outside of what they already do not provide, if that makes sense for people. So these are just kind of things to be thinking about and considerations to have going into these conversations, understanding that you've seen one disability support office, you've seen one disability support office. And so it's important to investigate these things up front so that you're not caught off guard on the back end. Healthcare considerations. This is something that rarely gets talked about ahead of time. So if your student has healthcare needs, you will want to connect with the student health center and see what types of supports they provide. So some student health centers only provide general care. So if the student gets a cold or has a sprained ankle or needs to have something looked at, they might provide that care. But other schools also provide, places where students can get, injections, or they might have a pharmacy where students can get their medication. But it's really important to investigate what is provided at that student health center upfront. General considerations for families. You need to think through, like, does the student need to be near a major medical center? For mental health conditions, can the student continue to see their current therapist, or will they need to get a new therapist? If they're going out of state, it's really critical to talk to their current therapist to see if they can continue via telehealth. There are rules and regulations around that. So it may not be as simple as you think to continue care with that person. And if the student needs to find a new healthcare provider, mental health care provider, or really any therapist near that campus, they'll want to start investigating that as soon as they commit to see, are there other healthcare providers available in the community? Are they accepting new patients? The counseling center on college campuses, most colleges will see the student a handful of times before they refer them out. So it's really important to understand that you might think your student can get mental health support on campus, which is true to a degree, but generally they'll be referred out after that. So it's really important to plan for that ahead of time. If your student has a medical specialist that they need, or if they need infusions, or if they need other things like that that might require more intensive care or more regular care, you really want to be factoring that into the college search process. A key point here too to consider is, will your insurance cover out-of-state providers? If your student decides to go to school in another state, you should be looking at whether or not they're going to need to get new insurance, or if they can continue on the same insurance. So that usually just requires a call to the insurance company to see how portable that insurance is. This transfer of care piece is something that is often left till the end, but we should be considering it as part of the search more holistically. So identifying care providers ahead of time, connecting with doctors before or as soon as possible after committing to the school. It can take a number of months for a student to even get in to see a doctor. I think we've all experienced that when you're trying to become a new patient. So you really want to hit the ground running and connect with those doctors so that your student can have that link prior to starting school at the end of August. So that's just a really important thing to think about. The other thing that usually gets left out when we're talking about transitioning to college is looking at leave of absence policies and withdrawal policies, especially for students who have mental health conditions or conditions that have flare-ups where maybe they're missing some school in high school now, a week, couple weeks. It's really, really critical to look at what the policies are at the institutions that they're considering. So the first thing you can do is just check the student handbook. Usually the leave policies are listed in there. And typically there are a couple types of leave that students might be able to take. One is a medical leave. So that would be if the student has a medical condition that rises up and they have to be away from school. The other type of leave is a personal leave of absence. And it's really important to look at what the re-entry policies are related to those things. So usually for a medical leave of absence, the student has to go back to provide documentation from their doctor about why they're ready to re-enter. And then there are dates for re-entry processes. With a personal leave, it might be something similar where the student has to indicate that they'd like to come back on a certain time frame, and then they can start the process for re-entry. If your student has a flare-up of their condition in the middle of the semester and they need to miss 2 weeks of class, and it's important to note that college classes are not as frequent as high school classes. So there might be a college class that meets just once a week, or you might have class twice, 2 or 3 times a week, but for shorter session times. But missing that much class can really impact a student. Depending on where they are in the semester, they might be able to take an incomplete and then finish that coursework up later, or they might have to withdraw from that course. So you'd want to know about the withdrawal policies You'd want to look at the deadlines. There are also financial implications related to taking a withdrawal. So it's important to know that students might be able to withdraw from a couple classes, or they might want to withdraw from the entire semester. It just kind of depends. And this is kind of an issue where it's a case by case scenario, but just being aware of what the options and opportunities are can be really helpful in that process. And also looking at what the school's policies are, because you might be investigating or looking for a more flexible policy, right? If you know that your student might have a flare up, or if you know that there might be some considerations or issues that you need to take into account. So you can look at that stuff up front so that you know what the rules and regulations are to help you in that process. I've put some essential skills here too. These are really, really critical. So students need to be able to talk about their disability in a way that they're comfortable with. And we know that, the more that students kind of practice this and talk about it, the easier it gets for them. So it's really important to engage your students in conversations with their healthcare providers, in their IEP meetings, in their 504 plan. Start to practice what they're going to say and how they're going to communicate what their needs are. Knowing their needs, so taking a time to look at all areas of the student's life. So eating, sleeping, school activities, social activities. What do they need to make those things run smoothly? Are their guardians kind of doing a lot of that micromanaging and making sure that they're taking their medications, making sure that they have what they need packed in their bag? Are there ways that we can start to give the student more responsibility now so that they're set up when they move away to college? Make a list of those things and walk through those things with the student. And preparing the student, it's important for them to know that everything's not always going to be perfect. So they have to have plans and strategies and tools in their toolbox so that they know who to talk to and how to communicate when something's not going right, so that they can get it resolved and get it fixed and be able to move forward. Steps to success. Start transition planning early as possible, yesterday. Start working on some of these planning and executive function skills, like the organization skills, self-monitoring. And where these usually come up for the students that I work with is around, medication management. Can the student manage their own medication? Can they put the pills in their pill box? Can they remember to take the pills? Do they have timers and reminders set up? Do they know how to refill their prescription? We can start coaching students on some of these responsibilities a little bit earlier on, so that they're not trying to do all this in the month or two before they're leaving for school, or so that they don't show up to school and not know how to get a refill. That's really, really important. Healthcare appointments. Does the student know who their doctors are? Do they know how to get in touch with their doctors? Can they pick up the phone and schedule their own appointments? Starting to work on these skills, which are also just like good adulting skills, can be really helpful too. Preparing the student for conversations with healthcare providers and university administrators. I know for myself, when I go to the doctor, I always try to write down questions in advance so that I have those questions ready to go. That's a really good practice for students too. And scripting out some of the things that they might want to share or might not want to share, so that they know what they don't want to say and they know what they do want to say, can be really helpful. And supporting them in developing independent living skills when they're living at home. And this is true for all students, not just students with disabilities. Do they know how to do their laundry? Do they know how to make a simple meal? Do they know how to use an ATM? How will they get money? So working through some of those things when they're still living at home, so that they have those skills ready when they're in school, can be really helpful. I put together just a general timeline here of what students have coming up. And the reason I put this up like this is because I think it's really helpful to see how much stuff happens in that junior and senior year. So the general timeline in junior year is that ACT, SAT prep, if your students are taking those exams, they're learning about colleges, they're touring, they've got college reps, they start thinking about scholarships, and there's a lot that happens in March through May with their SATs and ACTs, AP exams, they're doing visits. Then junior year, the end of that summer, they've drafting their essays, they're doing their interviews, they're getting their recommendation letters, they're completing the FAFSA or their financial aid stuff. Simultaneously, there's a lot of disability related stuff happening too, or that should be happening. They should be thinking about the college accommodations. If they need an extra support program, like one of those fee-based programs that I mentioned. And it's important to understand that if your student has a learning disability, there are only 2 colleges in the United States that are catered specifically towards students with learning disabilities, Beacon College and Landmark College. Beacon is in Florida, Landmark is in Vermont. Those are the 2 schools that are specifically for students with learning disabilities. Outside of that, there are support programs at universities across the United States that have learning disability specific support programs. But again, you'd want to look at and investigate those things. So you need to know in advance which schools have what, and then outlining the students' needs. So they need personal care needs. So they have healthcare issues that they might need to think about. Then you're taking tours, you're coming up with questions, you're thinking about disability related scholarships. Maybe it's a summer program. So there's a lot that happens in this junior, senior year. So getting an even earlier start on some of the executive function and independent living skills can be really helpful. Senior year, the general timeline, you might be retaking the ACT or SAT, revising your essay, getting your application stuff, preparing that CSS profile or the FAFSA profile for your financial aid needs. Early decision, early action. There are all these things now that weren't around when I applied to college, because I remember writing things, by hand and then typing them up. But these things start to happen a lot quicker now, and students will start to feel a lot more energy and maybe anxiety around them. But the disability related concerns too, for some of those support programs that are application based, there are deadlines for those. So you have to be thinking about that, continuing that communication with the disability support offices, gathering documentation, comparing the colleges, because once you start talking to disability support offices, it will become more obvious that some provide better supports than others. And then applying for accommodations once the student has committed. So it doesn't stop once the student commits. There's actually more to do at that point, then the continuity of care, then the hiring of a personal care attendant. And for parents, there's also this added piece about HIPAA, FERPA, medical power of attorney. So once your student matriculates to college or turns 18, there's a lot more to think about in relation to how they are going to navigate that adult space of managing their own lives. And so if you need to have access to some of those things, you might want to talk to your student about, whether or not they want you to have access to their grades. And for the legal documentation, like medical power of attorney, like if they got injured or if they were sick, would they want you to be a part of that process and supporting them? So that's something really important to talk about. I provide a lot of support and resources, but I also connect people with other people if I'm not the right person. So just generally, the kinds of things that you have available at your disposal, your high school counselor or an independent college consultant might be able to help you find the right academic fit for the student in college, the right culture fit. There are independent college consultants who support students specifically with learning disabilities, ADD, autism. So you can always connect with me and I'll put my information up and I can point you to some of those people. There's an organization called IECA, Independent Educational Consultants Association. They have a search, so you can search and see if there's a consultant that you might want to connect with. There's another organization called HECA, which is Higher Education Consultants Association. So if you're looking for an independent college consultant, those might be good places for you to start. Your high school counselor might also be a really good place to start as well. And those people know, the ins and outs of the schools, and they've visited the colleges and they've had conversations about just the general academics at that school. And they can tell you whether or not your student could get into that school based on their grades and test scores and whatnot. In terms of in terms of accommodations, preparation, and continuity of care, I support students with physical disabilities and chronic health conditions. I know other consultants who work specifically with students with learning disabilities, autism, ADD. And so I can point you to some of those people as well. but I work with students on the transition process, so helping them investigate what questions they should be asking the disability support offices, thinking through the types of accommodations they might need in the college setting, getting them prepared for those self-advocacy skills, and talking through the continuity of care pieces. I have a blog, a monthly newsletter, and I'm all over social media, Facebook, Instagram. You can find me there. And we also have a group that I coordinate with 2 college consultants that's called College Success, Physical Disabilities, Chronic Health, and Mental Health. So it's really focused on those 3 categories of students. There are other Facebook groups that are focused more on autism, learning disabilities, and things like that. So I can point people to those if you're interested. And I also have a partnership with the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. So students with any type of paralysis, that could be a student who was born with cerebral palsy or spina bifida, or a student who's had a stroke and has some related paralysis, or a student who has a neurological condition, can connect with me or the Reeve Foundation directly to take advantage of some free sessions with me to talk about that transition to college. Here is my contact information. So you can reach me on my website, which is accessiblecollege.com. You can also email me at info@accessiblecollege.com. And like I said, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. And I'm happy to connect people with other people if I'm not the right person. So you should feel free to reach out. And once again, I'm sorry that I was not able to be there in person with you today, but you can connect with me one of these ways if you have questions. And I'm glad that I got to do this recording. I know that it would have been better if I was in person, but feel free to reach out. And thank you so much. And I hope you learned something here today. Thanks. Bye.